Hey everyone, Ted Bauman here. I know it's been a while since I posted my last video. I am doing my best, but I am heavily engaged in a new project, which I'm going to be telling you more about the next time I post, and it involves some very interesting activities, particularly with regard to global migration. That's people moving from country to country, and a lot of times people moving out of the United States because they're concerned about the direction the country is taking. So stay tuned for that. For now, I want to talk about one of the things that a lot of people often associate with the decline of the United States, which is the demise of the dollar. Now, what does it mean to say that the dollar is threatened with demise? Well, basically the idea is that in the near future, the world will have a system of different reserve currencies, not just the US dollar, which is the situation today, and that indicates a dramatic scaling back in the influence of the United States, and also a potential for a massive shock to the US economy and to US consumers because of the privileges that go with being able to print the reserve currency. Now here's a chart that shows talk about de-dollarization. On the right hand side you got news articles, on the left hand side you got tweets. But really the big spike in discussion about the potential decline of the dollar came right about the time that the US and other countries imposed sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. And we've now got to a situation where at the beginning of 2023, for no reason that I can think of, you're getting hundreds of news articles every month and thousands, tens of thousands of tweets by people talking about how the dollar is about to collapse. Well, we'll talk about whether that's realistic right now, but why do I think this is happening? Well, fundamentally, I think that the de-dollarization trope, the idea that the dollar is about to fall off its perch, tends to go with people who, or tends to come from people who have bones to pick with the US government and with the Federal Reserve. They're usually gold bugs. They're people who dislike the idea of the Fed actively managing interest rates and all this other stuff. People who predict hyperinflation, the same basic crowd of people who are always warning that the US is about to become Zimbabwe or Venezuela because of free printing of US dollars. So it has a lot to do with that mindset. Now, before we address the realistics of whether or not the dollar can be challenged by other currencies in the near future, let's look at some factors behind the US dollar's dominance. Here's a chart that shows the US share and the US dollar share of a couple of different things. On the left-hand side, you see the US share of global trade and global GDP. And as you can see, the US accounts for nearly 25% of global GDP, despite the fact that the US only has about 5% of the global population. Its share of global trade is smaller, which indicates that a lot of what's happening in terms of global GDP is internal. But look at the use of the dollar in various types of financial transactions. Cross-border loans, 50%. International debt securities, nearly 50%. Foreign exchange transaction volumes, nearly 90%. Official foreign exchange reserves held by sovereign countries, over 50%, close to 60 probably. Trade invoicing, half of global trade in dollars. SWIFT payments, about 45%. Now, the point here is that the dollar is an absolutely critical currency in the global economy. Why is that the case? Well, there are two things really that support the dollar's current role in the US or the global economy. The first is that after World War II, the dollar, or rather the US economy, was the only global economy that was relatively unscathed. The economy had grown so much during the war that it was the only plausible source of financing for reconstruction of Europe and the Far East, i.e. known as the Marshall Plan. Now, also, the US had about 70% of the world's gold bullion at the time, which made people feel that, well, the dollar is probably going to be the safest currency to hold in the future. And so in December 1945, 19 countries signed an agreement that established the international monetary system that we have today, including the International Monetary Fund and what would eventually become the World Bank. And they put the US really at the head of both of those institutions. Now, part of the calculus after World War II was that the US was more of a democracy than any of the other major powers at the time, which was thought to help protect the US dollar from abusing the international monetary system on its own account. In other words, because the US was more accountable, it was thought it would be less likely that the US dollar would be subject to the kind of mismanagement and abuse that you might have seen from other currencies in the past. Now, the second factor was the emergence of what are known as petrodollars. Now, after the global energy crisis of the 1970s, the United States concluded really an informal agreement with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf kingdoms that said oil will always be traded and priced in US dollars. In other words, if you want oil from the Gulf, you have to pay in US dollars. And that created a demand for dollars that persists to this day. And that had the effect of making the US dollar the absolutely critical currency to have for almost any country or corporation trading globally. It also led to the accumulation of massive reserves of US dollars on the part of sovereign banks and reserve banks of various countries and regions in order to be able to fund trade. And this is really the situation that we're in today. Now, those two factors, the emergence of the US after World War II and the petrodollars, are linked in the sense that in the early 1970s, President Nixon of the US decided to abandon the gold standard, which meant that because gold was no longer the underpinning of the US dollar's value and its relative value compared to other currencies, the US dollar had to stand on its own 2 feet. And it's really done so ever since then. Obviously, it's gone up and down in value vis-a-vis other currencies over the years, but still, to this day, the US dollar continues to be the global reserve currency. Now, there's also a third factor behind all of this, which is a little more difficult to see, and it's also one that some of the dollar naysayers tend to ignore, which is the sheer power of the US economy, which is the ultimate backstop of the US dollar's value. Now, I've already pointed out that in 1990, the US accounted for about 25% of the world GDP, or rather today. Well, that's the same as it was in the 1990s. In other words, the US has not lost any of its share of global GDP really in the last generation, and that's an indication of how robust the economy continues to be. The US accounts for 58%, almost 60% of GDP for the group of 7 most advanced industrial economies, up from 40% in 1990. So in just the last generation, the US has become even more powerful, even more of a role player, the critical role player in the advanced developed economy. On a purchasing power basis, the US has the highest average incomes of any developed country. Now, you often see GDP measures like GDP per capita, and it'll say, okay, well, Luxembourg is the highest GDP per capita, Ireland is number 2. But the critical thing is that on a purchasing power basis, what you can actually buy with that country's currency, the US has the highest average incomes, not necessarily on a per person basis, but the highest average incomes of any developed country. Again, the US is a powerful economy. The US owns more than 20% of all global patents. That's more than China and Germany put together. The US stock market has been the world's best performing asset class for the last 30 years. And despite the recent bout of inflation, the US Fed is perceived to be the most responsible and technically proficient money manager in the world. Now, a lot of people would quibble, they might disagree with some of those points, but the numbers don't lie. If the US dollar is ultimately backed by the strength of the US economy, the numbers tell you that despite China's rise, the US economy continues to be the most robust, the most powerful, the most creative in the world, whether we like it or not. Now, what would it take to knock the dollar off its perch? Well, several things would have to happen more or less simultaneously for the dollar to lose its dominance. The first thing is that major commodities like oil would have to be traded in currencies other than the dollar. In other words, countries that are completely unrelated to, say, China would have to be prepared to pay in Chinese yuan to, say, Saudi Arabia to buy its oil the way they currently do with dollars. But that's not happening. We have seen the Chinese, for example, pay in yuan for oil from the Gulf, but that doesn't mean that third countries are starting to do that. The second thing that would have to happen is that other countries would have to start outperforming the US economically to such an extent that the future value of their currencies was seen as more secure, more dependable than the dollar. And we certainly aren't seeing that right now. I mean, the big competitor, the one everybody talks about, is China. But the Chinese economy is slowing down dramatically. We're beginning to see serious cracks in its financial system. We've seen a lot of intervention, particularly in its technology sector, which has knocked trillions of dollars and yuan of value off of their domestic companies, their domestic stock market, which is not a good sign. And the other thing, of course, is that any other country like China wanting to provide a reserve currency for the world would have to be seen as stable and as trustworthy as the US has been with its own currency and economy. The problem is that none of those conditions are emerging. The biggest challenge is that the only realistic competitor to the dominance of the dollar is the Chinese yuan. But China is not a democracy, and it has proved to be a highly unreliable global partner. The yuan is only involved in 7% of global transactions compared to over 50% for the US, and it's not freely traded. The yuan's price is not set by the free play of currency traders and arbitrage like the US dollar is. It's tightly regulated by the Chinese central bank. And that is not a good place to be, because if you hold yuan as a reserve currency and the Chinese central bank changes its approach to managing the value of that currency, you could end up with big losses. Whereas people who hold the dollar know that the dollar goes up and down with on the basis of numerous types of indicators, numerous trends in the global economy, but it's predictable based on those trends. And you know the Fed is not going to intervene to lock the dollar to a certain exchange rate the way the Chinese do with their currency. And that means that you can at least rely on the dollar's reliance on the market, which is what you definitely want to have. You don't want to be reliant on bureaucrats and politicians. Paradoxically, the criticism that the anti-dollar folks tend to throw at the dollar. Now, the second factor, of course, is that China is essentially an autocracy. Xi Jinping is essentially a dictator. They have the appearance of a party system, and of course the Chinese Communist Party is powerful, but he is at the pinnacle of it. It's something completely different from the scenario that you have in the US. With all the strains that the US is facing politically, all the talk about sliding into fascism and all these other sorts of things, it's still a robust, no-holds-barred democracy where people say whatever they think, which means that there's a lot more space for creativity, for good or for bad, than there is in China. China also maintains strict capital controls, unlike the US, which allows currencies to flow in and out and for exchange rates to be set on the market basis. So, bottom line here is that if you really think that the dollar is going to collapse shortly, you have to show A, which currency is going to take over from it, and B, you're going to have to show why, if that currency is the Chinese yuan, how those concerns are going to be addressed. The numbers don't lie, folks. Right now, the US dollar continues to be the #1 traded currency, the reserve currency for the entire global economy. And yes, it's under strain. Yes, the US dollar has been dispersed in dramatic fashion by the Fed during the course of the last 10 or 15 years worth of quantitative easing, but that's now being reversed again at considerable pain. And it's that willingness to inflict that pain that gives a lot of foreign holders of dollars the confidence to continue to do that, because they know that the dollar is being managed reasonably professionally and based on the independence of the Federal Reserve. Now, if you don't like the fact that the Federal Reserve operates those policies, if you don't like US government policy, that's one thing. But if you really think that that's going to knock the dollar off its perch, you've got to show the facts. And so far, the facts don't support that. Anyway, this is Ted Bauman signing off. I will be sharing some new videos on my new project sometime in the next couple of days or weeks, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon.